So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to the next in the series of faction showcases, and as said previously, we will be having a look at the Principality of Dol Amroth, the Vassals of Gondor. Now, naturally, as a result of their being vassals of Gondor, this is the faction which we're going to be comparing them to most directly, and they do share quite a lot of similarities. But Dol Amroth in general are more well known for their cavalry. They tended to have, in the lore, they tended to handle all of the sort of cavalry-based engagements. And this does reflect in their rosters as well. In terms of their infantry and archers, however, there is a little bit more of a... There are subtle differences between the two. Generally speaking, Gondor have a more defensive faction shape to them, whereas Dol Amroth have a tendency to maybe be a little bit more aggressive, but as a Númenórean inheritor faction tends to be, they do have quite a defensive edge to them nonetheless, but just because of how the factions are shaped. Now, having a look, we will start off with our artillery, and there is something a little bit worth... oh, hang on a moment. There is something a little bit worth going into before we start, and that is, of course, the trebuchet. And only the Númenórean inheritors get access to this, so Cardlan, Arthedain, Gondor, and a couple of others. But nonetheless, it is quite a useful tool, but you're only really going to be seeing them in siege battles, because in an open field they are a little bit too inaccurate and a little bit too geared for long-range conflicts, whereas in a field battle, of course, people are going to be trying to get right up in your face, generally, if you're using a trebuchet. Although certain maps you can use siege equipment like this to be useful on, it is expensive, so that does eat into your funds a little bit. Catapult will likely be a little bit more common on field battles, but again, likely to be confined to siege battles and specific maps rather than anything else. And of course then you have the ballista, which again, very good for counter-sniping other pieces of siege equipment, but other than that, not likely to be making too many appearances on an open field like this grassy plain anyway. Now we will get into the infantry, which is where Dol Amroth, again, like most factions, we will start to see their more unique nature come out. Not in the civilians, of course, because this is, again, a unit they share with quite a few other kingdoms of men, including Cardlan and Rohan, who we haven't got to yet, but we will. But this is the first unit, again, and this is, well, the first unique unit that Dol Amroth have. That is the Dor en Ernil Swordsman, and again, this is the first similarity that they share with their overlords in Gondor, because their militia unit is again a sword and shield unit as opposed to a spear and shield unit. So this means they will be a little bit better in a sustained melee, particularly with other low tier units. They'll be able to inflict casualties on the trash tier of orcs, for example. Their stats aren't particularly high, but they do have a relatively low recruitment cost of 400 and a decent amount of men per unit. But generally speaking, you're probably going to be punting for the more expensive, better rounded units than this militia swordsman unit if you can afford it. But again, it's just a sort of cheaper alternative. Dol Amroth's real quality lies in their infantry line over here anyway, with some of their more expensive units. And we shall start off with their primary line infantry, which is the Etalond Men-at-Arms, or Ekalond Men-at-Arms. I'm not entirely sure how you pronounce that, but I get Tolkien's pronunciations wrong all the time. But here you can see, obviously, a unit which is very reminiscent of the Gondor infantry. They have relatively low attack values compared to some other units, but their defense values are where they really shine because of their high armor and shield values for their class. Now, obviously, their defensive skill is not particularly high as a result of this, but they will be able to absorb a lot of arrow fire, and of course, if a unit is not AP, they will struggle to bring down the Etalond Men-at-Arms unless they are significantly higher quality than they are. Now if you look over here as well, you can see that you can upgrade the armour of them. Unlike with the Gondorians, you can only upgrade it by one level, so this is one area in which Dol Amroth falls short of their overlords. But generally speaking, they are very equivalent to one another, and they will do 9 times out of 10 just as good a job as the Gondor infantry. It's that 10th time, though, which sometimes the 2 armour upgrades can influence a fight a little bit more. Then we have actually a unit that you cannot upgrade the armour of, but it is the Tarnostian Guard, which is essentially the equivalent to the Gondor Spearmen. And this is actually a unit which is not as good as the Gondor Spears overall, I don't think, mainly because you cannot upgrade the armour at all, and their armour values are only 6, and of course the Gondor Spears can really pack on the armour with the silver shields once they get up there. They do cost 600, but they will fulfill essentially the same role. Low attack values, again, with that infantry malus means they're not going to do too well in a pure infantry fight, but of course using them to secure the flanks from enemy cavalry, using them to influence enemy cavalry fights in general, is going to be primarily what they're used for. You know, if you wanted a solid front line, all-around front line, you're probably going to want to look elsewhere, unless you wanted to make liberal use of that shield wall. You'll have to excuse the dog barking in the background if you can hear that, but moving on. We do actually have a unit which can find a place in the Dol Amroth roster, despite the fact the Edelond men-at-arms are going to be much more commonplace. That is the Mercenary Guildsmen. They are, in terms of stats, lower all around, and of course, as mercenary units, tend to have lower morale than the equivalents that you can buy. But generally, the reason you'd want to buy them is you've already expended the amount of Edelond men-at-arms you are allowed, and maybe want a little bit more in terms of line infantry. Quite a rare occurrence, to be fair. Or maybe you just want to take advantage of the slightly higher manpower count in the Mercenary Guildsman unit. But other than that, of course, we've seen them several times before, a unit they share with several other factions, and it won't be the last we see of them either. We also have the first pike unit, well, the first polearm unit, I should say, of Dol Amroth, and that is the Doran Ernil pikemen. Now, obviously, as pikes, they have generally lower stats across the board, but 600 is not a bad price to pay for a basic pike. They are, of course, quite similar in many ways to the other low-tier pikes, the Greenwatch Garrison Footmen from Cardland would be a good equivalent. However, unlike them, you can upgrade the armour of these guys, and they look pretty snazzy when you upgrade the armour of them, so of course this means they're going to be a little bit tougher to break down. Although, to be fair, when it comes to pikes, as soon as the gap is closed to the point where they are taking hits in melee, they're probably going to start falling apart regardless of their armor value, but even so, it's nice to have nonetheless a little bit more protection against arrows. And again, like the equivalents to Gondor, you know, the Guards of Osgiliath are all around a significantly better unit. However, you can mass up the Doran Ernil pikemen more, so you can saturate your line with more pikes if you need to, which of course, as I've said numerous times before, you can slow down enemy infantry armies of significantly higher cost with good use of pikemen, which is obviously a good thing. Another thing which can be used as both a defensive and an offensive tool are halberdiers, and the Edelond halberdiers are among some of the better basic halberdiers that you can buy in the game. They have decent stats for halberds, although the defensive values primarily come from the higher armour. Obviously, again, like most halberds and pikes, they can form phalanx. They also have that bonus against cavalry, but the effectiveness against armour is obviously where they can really shine. The only real choice that Gondor have in this area would be the Fountain Guard, which are of course very expensive and are a big focal point of their army, which people often try to focus down. But the Edelond halberdiers, again, you can have more of them. Now, they're not exactly cheap at 650, but again, this is the sort of price you would expect to pay for some sort of getting up to mid-tier to higher tier infantry, that sort of thing. But obviously Edelond halberdiers will be able to slow down, well, and even defeat in many cases with their phalanx, provided they get a favourable engagement. Very good unit. Stuff like the Guardians of Kharndoom will not like going up against the AP that these guys can offer, but of course they have the same weaknesses as any halberdier, and they don't have as high a soldier count per unit as compared to some of the Orc halberdiers like the Morannon halberds, for example, so you do need to watch out for that. But individually, very good unit. They've been a favourite for quite some time. You can just see how many mid-tiers that Dol Amroth have to choose from. If you don't count the armour upgrade models, then they have just as much as Gondor. But here we have some of the slightly higher quality units, starting off with the Tirithea Wardens, and again, when you compare them to Gondor, the equivalent would be the Citadel Guard. However, they are certainly not as strong as the Citadel Guard, mainly because they are not AP. But other than that, they are still very, very competent spearmen indeed. They, of course, can make shield wall. Of course, they have a bonus fighting cavalry. Their attack is still very low, of course, like most more defensive-natured spearmen like this are. But their total defense values are significantly higher, obviously 23. Very nice armor values, but their defensive skill is also not bad for a spear unit that has high armor either. And, of course, a decent shield value. 700 is honestly not too expensive for a unit of this type, but it is a specific build that you're going to be using higher tier spears in anyway. Unlike the Citadel Guard with their AP, you're going to struggle to use these guys in an offensive capacity, but they are still a very good defensive bulwark. Another unit, however, which Dol Amroth can certainly use on the attack are the Black Swan Vanguard, which are an armour-piercing heavy infantry unit, and I suppose the most direct equivalent might be the Loka Flag Rim from Rune. But the Black Swan Vanguard are of higher quality than them. They are more expensive as well at 850, and you can only have 2 before the cost increases. But they are definitely a very strong point of the Dol Amroth front line, because especially if you combine them with the Edelond halberdiers, armoured front lines are going to melt before your infantry. And obviously they're effective against armour. Their attack is 9, which for a unit that has a cost of 850 is actually not that bad. I mean, if you look at equivalents in terms of cost, like the Guardians of Kharndoom, they're not going to be getting much more, or even sometimes less than that. And of course that armour piercing really does add a lot, and their defence values are very high, so a real high point of the Dol Amroth infantry, in my opinion, one of the real gems of the good factions infantry forces. But of course they are rather limited in the numbers that you can bring them, so you do need to choose where to commit them quite wisely, and obviously they won't do very well against factions like Linden as a general rule. And now we will get onto the General's Bodyguard units, or well, the upper tier units that Dol Amroth can bring. And we'll start off with the Talon Knights, and actually the interesting thing about the Talon Knights is you can bring 2 before the cost increases, which is rare for a unit which has multiple HP, but it isn't actually something they share with Gondor, of course, because you can only have 1 Warden of the White Tower, I believe, unless that was changed since last I looked at it. But this is actually something they share as well with Arthedain and their dismounted Dunedain Knights, who again we'll get onto them at some point soon. Their stats, however, are actually slightly lower than something like the Carmel's Chosen, which you can only have 1 of, so do bear that in mind. They do have the same cost, generally speaking, as multiple HP Spearmen, rather than the sort of uber tier infantry. But they still, of course, will stand up very, very well, provided they're backed up to a lot of basic units. Obviously, they've got their swans on their helms as well. However, in terms of a powerhouse, in terms of a melee infantry unit, very few units in the game can claim to be the match of the Haven Guard, and obviously this is where probably Dol Amroth's pride and joy in terms of their infantry. Obviously, I like their Grey Warden-esque helms, inspire nearby troops, fight nearby enemy infantry, like most of these very high tier units will do. 1200, and obviously their stats across the board. This is very high defense for a unit that doesn't have a shield, high skill of course for a 2-handed sword unit, and nice armor values as well, but really it's the attack where they come good. That attack value of 24 is going to be very difficult to stand up to. Even armoured units are going to fall in droves to the Haven Guard if they are ill prepared and ill supported. Of course, this goes both ways. The Haven Guard are limited in terms of their manpower, so you do need to back them up, otherwise they will be overwhelmed. But of course, you know, the eternal rivalry between them and the Temple Executioners, as they are now called, continues, because they are very, very similar in how effective they can be. But now we shall move on to the Archers and the Cavalry, which is where Dol Amroth have maybe a little bit more of a departure from Gondor in certain areas, but we'll move on to that now. So it is fine margins when you look at the differences between Dol Amroth and Gondor, and overall I would say in terms of their archers, Gondor focus a little bit more on survivability, whereas Dol Amroth focus maybe a little bit more on damage, but again it is very fine margins, because the first unit we can see here, the basic Dor Enil archers, are clearly an equivalent to the basic Gondor archers. Now of course the missile attack of 5 is pretty standard for an archer unit like this. 550 is not a huge amount to spend on a unit which can stand up reasonably well in a skirmish fight. Obviously you have the armor value of 6, which is not terrible. They don't have a shield, however, which can leave them at a bit of a disadvantage when compared to some. But you can upgrade the armor of them, which is always a big plus. Makes them just that little bit tougher, and of course makes them able to withstand a lot more firepower. But again, the basic armored human archer, and yeah, this gives Dol Amroth a good basis for their skirmish line, which is important, of course, because a skirmish fight is something you're going to have to engage in quite a bit, and generally speaking this is how the good kingdoms of men will go about their business, with the exception of Rohan. But we shall also move on to a javelin unit, the Belfalas Marines, which again obviously going to be very similar to the Pelagia Marines in most anything they do. Again, missile attack of 8, but bonus against cavalry, effective against armor. Their stats overall are actually not terrible for a melee unit, so you can use them as a sort of makeshift infantry unit as well, but don't expect them to sort of carry the day in melee. 650 is not a huge amount to spend on them either, so if you're expecting a lot of enemy cavalry, or a very dug-in enemy position that you need to try and weaken before you engage, then the Belfalas Marines will always do very good for you, and obviously in a siege they can be, javelins like this can be irreplaceable for defending or attacking a front line. Now we shall move on to the slightly higher tier units that Dol Amroth have available to them, and this is definitely a more defensive focused unit with a very high armor value of 10, the Tirith Ea Marksman, which overall can be viewed as an equivalent to the Caer Andros Marksman, and again in melee they are pretty damn good, although probably not quite as good as the Caer Andros Marksman, it must be said, with their 2-handed swords in melee. They can still dish it out, they can hang, and they don't have a shield value as well, but again with an armor value like that it's not going to be the end of the world. 800 is quite a lot to splash out on a unit like this, though, but if you wanted to go very skirmish heavy, very resilient, then the Tirith Ea Marksmen are almost certainly going to be a part of your plans. However, as far as I'm aware, Dol Amroth, just like Gondor, do have 2 ranger units, but both of them are a little bit more affordable. Starting off with the Blackroot Vale Archers, which obviously they're going to be dreadful in a skirmish fight, but again, missile attack of 5, that body piercing is always going to be very important, and the slightly higher tier version are the Nimrodel Rangers, which look very, very mean indeed, slightly more expensive, but again just slightly better across the board. They actually have a missile attack of 6, so again this does lend a bit of credence to the fact that Dol Amroth's skirmish line is going to be a little bit more attack focused than Gondor's, because so far the only ranger we've met with 6 missile damage was the Delupeng I Emunduia from Mirkwood, and Mirkwood by and large are the most archer focused faction in the game. So Dol Amroth certainly piling on the pressure there, but of course they don't really have as much of a selection in terms of archers as Gondor, but they still have enough, in my opinion, to make them able to go toe-to-toe with anyone in just about any situation and not be humiliated, which is, you know, that versatility is part of what the Kingdom's men are all about. Again, one of the hidden gems, though, as we get into Dol Amroth's cavalry, which is where I'm expecting most people would imagine Dol Amroth's strength are, and they are not incorrect about this. The Dol Amroth cavalry are a very cheap Lancer unit of 400. Obviously, they only have a charge bonus of 5, but this is an AP charge, and this is essentially a militia tier Lancer cavalry. And you really shouldn't underestimate how powerful these guys can be. Obviously, they're going to be pretty dreadful individually in a melee fight, but there are a lot of them. There are 90 of them, so that's a lot of mass charging towards a line. Armor piercing as well. I've seen these guys used, and I've actually used these guys to good effect as well in the past, and I'm not the best cavalry player, but having a unit that you can just saturate the field with cavalry like this can be very effective. Obviously, it's less effective against factions which can successfully counter cavalry. Obviously, factions like Khand are going to gobble up units like this all day, but if you're facing off against factions which maybe struggle to cover the field in cavalry quite as much, they can be very, very useful for finding those gaps in the enemy line, because you don't really mind if they die, honestly. A unit that costs 400, that's cheaper than nearly all of Dol Amroth's infantry other than the civilians. Moving on, we have a mainstay in quite a lot of factions, the Merc cavalry, and this is the first of Dol Amroth's melee cavalry. And the melee cavalry is honestly where Dol Amroth have their primary strength. They are very, very good in a sustained melee with enemy cavalry, and indeed I think only Khand can claim, and even then it'd be a close run fight in a pure melee sense between Khand and Dol Amroth, and a lot of this comes down to the amount of melee cavalry they can field. The Merc cavalry, of course, is known throughout the mod as a sort of the most basic melee cavalry. They don't do anything particularly well, but they're not, you know, they are essentially the unit that you will use to hunt down Lancers. They may not win against very high tier Lancer cavalry, but they will still get cost efficiency out of it. And also they have an armor upgrade as well to make them that little bit more resilient to enemy archer fire. Dol Amroth also have access to the mercenary crossbowmen, which does give them a skirmish cavalry. However, this is a unit which is very, very difficult to get the best out of, because enemy archers will immediately try to target them because they do have relatively low range. They do have very high missile attack, however. This is higher than, I think, any footbound crossbow other than the sort of specialty units like the Dragon's Wrath crossbows. But of course they don't have the highest range to capitalise on this. They're very micro-intensive, they're very easy to counter, but potentially sometimes they could swing a cav fight into your favour, but do be careful when you use them. You know, the melee cavalry will appreciate having them around to help affect a fight, but they are difficult to use. Now we get onto another Lancer unit. If you want a little bit more of a higher tier Lancer, not the Dol Amroth cavalry, you have the Tarnostian Lancers. 700 is honestly still not a huge amount for a Lancer. Now they do have a charge bonus of 10, effective against armour, so other cav units that have got a charge bonus of 10 include stuff like the Noriterno cavalry from Imladris. They of course have a nice shield, as do the Dol Amroth cavalry, but of course their stats are just a little bit better and the charge bonus is the main thing. Good armour on them as well. As we move on to another melee cavalry unit, and unlike the Merc cavalry, these guys are anything but standard. We have the Swan Knights with their two-handed swords. Now, this is actually a distinction they share with the Mounted Temple Inquisitors from Mordor. Now, they aren't quite as strong as that, but they still cause fear, and they have that nice bonus against cavalry, of course. 1,000 is quite a lot to spend on the Swan Knights, but obviously blocking enemy cavalry with your defensive melee cavalry is one of Dol Amroth's biggest strengths, in my opinion. And obviously the Swan Knights are a big part of that. 1-to-1, there are very few melee cavalry units which would want to take this fight. Even some of the really high tier stuff is going to want to stay clear of it, just because they will take damage from being in melee with Swan Knights. Moving on, however, we then have the highest damage dealing, well, the highest tier Lancer that Dol Amroth have available to them. That is the Knights of the Silver Swan. Cost the same, but of course they are a Lancer cavalry. They inspire nearby troops, which is nice. They frighten nearby enemy infantry, so in a situation where you get a hammer and anvil charge onto the rear of an enemy infantry line, chances are you're going to send them running unless they are very high tier units. Obviously charge bonus of 15, it's not the full 20, but Dol Amroth, you know, the defensive stats on this is obviously very impressive with that armour of 11. Shield of 6, it's going to be very difficult for basic archers to have much of an effect on them as they charge forward, which is always nice. Very good looking unit as well, one of my favourite looking units in the game. And then of course we have the equivalents to the Witch Realm Inquisitors we saw last time, the Haven Knights, possibly, in terms of, you know, they are up there with the strongest melee cavalry units in the game. Obviously 1500, they've been taken to being called melee knights, which is something which only they and the Witch Realm Inquisitors really have. maybe the Nurad Windblades, but they're a slightly different kind of unit, a little bit more focused around speed, getting in and out quickly and doing a lot of damage. But the Haven Knights, of course, have that shield, very high armor, defensive skill, multiple HP, obviously, very expensive, but very often in a field battle you'll be seeing Dol Amroth use the Haven Knights because they're just so difficult to bring down, and they offer such a good defensive shield to your backlines, because very, very little in terms of cavalry is going to want to get anywhere near the Haven Knights. Obviously inspires nearby troops, bonus fighting cavalry, and they frighten nearby enemy infantry as well, so you could get a recharge and of course send units running. So yeah, that is Dol Amroth's roster: infantry, archers, cavalry, and anything else you would care to mention. So now we shall go back to the faction selections, the army selection screen I should say, and we'll talk a little bit more about what I think of them. Dol Amroth, I think, are quite popular. Maybe not as popular as they used to be when they were first introduced, but I certainly feel as though they fit my personal playstyle quite well, because they are very capable of being aggressive. You can use your polearms in an aggressive manner. They've certainly got solid frontline infantry, but what I really like about them is their ability to defend their backlines very effectively from enemy cavalry and the like, because they have such a nasty selection of melee cavalry. And also you can turn that around. If you want to spend most of your money on melee cavalry like the Haven Knights and the Swan Knights, you can also throw in some cheap Dor Amroth cavalry to start probing the enemy's backlines as well. And this is personally what I would do. The vast majority of opponents I would run up against as Dol Amroth, maybe going a little bit less cavalry heavy if I thought I was going up against someone like Khan, who can more easily sort of try and skirmish with their horse archers, and then when it comes down to a melee fight they can definitely hang with Dol Amroth. But Dol Amroth are of course a very versatile faction. Most of the good kingdoms of men, and even some of the evil men, share this versatility. They're not really bad at anything, which is a very big draw for any faction. The flip side to this, I suppose, is that maybe you could say that compared to Gondor, they don't really have the really genuinely scary units on foot, other than the Haven Knights. You know, the Black Swan Vanguard are very good, but also they're not as good as something like the Fountain Guard, which can really carry the day for Gondor. Having said that, I think I would still prefer to play as Dol Amroth than Gondor. I think that overall they have got a lot of units which I like. I mean, I just said that the Black Swan Vanguard might not be as good as the Fountain Guard, but they are still a very unique unit in many ways among the good kingdoms of men. They focus on AP, which is something which generally the evil men definitely have in their favour, but with the Black Swan Vanguard it really gives Dol Amroth a strong point. They obviously have those halberdiers as well, so a lot of AP, or if you wanted to go a little bit more defensive you could use the pikes and the basic infantry. They've really got everything. Their basic spears, the Tarnostian Guard, are maybe not as good as several other equivalents from stuff like Cardlan or Gondor, but they'll do the job, and they're only 600 florins anyway. Having access to 2 rangers is something which is quite rare. I think only they and Gondor are actually the ones that can boast that. Good selection of siege. They really have anything you could need, generally speaking. So yeah, I give Dol Amroth my seal of approval. I would say that if you wanted a faction which could do anything, they are certainly, you know, with a little bit more of a weighting on their cavalry in a defensive sense, then Dol Amroth are certainly that. They're not quite the jack of all trades that Rune and Arthedain are, but still, they can definitely put up a fight in any theatre of war, as it were. So yeah, I think that is all I have to say on Dol Amroth. But looking forwards, we are making a return to the Elven/Dwarven part of the army selections, and we've already done all the dwarves, so we are going to be returning to one of the 2 elves. And I think we'll have a look at one of the more hotly debated factions next with regards to their place in the balancing, and we'll take a look at Linden. So yeah, I hope you found this somewhat informative, and I hope you'll join me for that.